7 retired military dogs had bitten, maimed, or terrorized every handler who tried to take them. The federal facility holding them had run out of options. The paperwork for their disposal had already been signed. Then, a 24-year-old woman nobody had ever heard of walked through the security gate, spoke a single name under her breath, and every single one of those dogs stopped moving at exactly the same moment. The room full of military veterans and federal agents went completely, utterly silent. Nobody could explain what they had just witnessed. Nobody except her. The Maricopa Federal Working Dog Transition Facilities sat on the western edge of the Arizona desert, 22 miles from the nearest town and deliberately difficult to find. There were no signs on the highway pointing toward it. It did not appear on most civilian maps. The corrugated steel buildings, the chain-link runs, the reinforced kennel blocks, all of it existed in a kind of institutional silence that the outside world was never meant to know about. It was not a rescue organization. It was not a rehabilitation center. It was the end of the line. Dogs arrived there from 3 different pipelines. Some came from dissolved military units whose missions had quietly concluded. Some were transferred from federal law enforcement teams that had been defunded or restructured. Some were simply the ones nobody else wanted anymore, too aggressive, too damaged, too deeply imprinted on handlers who were either dead or deployed somewhere unreachable. Every dog that landed at the Maricopa facility carried a file. Inside those files were incident reports, bite records, behavioral assessments, and a final recommendation column that almost always said the same thing: disposition. Pending, it was a bureaucratic word that meant the same thing in every language. It meant the decision had been made. The paperwork was waiting for one final signature. Facility Director Robert Mack was a retired Army Master Sergeant with 19 years of military police experience, a permanently damaged left knee, and absolutely no patience for sentimentality. He ran the facility like a forward operating base. Schedules were rigid, rules were absolute. Every dog was handled at arm's length, behind reinforced barriers, by staff wearing full bite sleeves and face shields. The 7 dogs currently in the high restriction block were not permitted direct contact with any staff member under any circumstances. They had each, in their own way, made that rule necessary. The 7 dogs had come in over a period of 14 months, each one from a different branch, a different mission, a different story. Ghost was a Belgian Malinois, male, 9 years old, 4 combat deployments, and a documented history of redirected aggression so severe that his last handler had required reconstructive surgery on his forearm. Ghost had not allowed a single human being to clip a leash to his collar in 8 months. Titan was a German shepherd, male, 7 years old, formerly assigned to a narcotics interdiction unit along the southern border. His handler had been killed during an ambush 3 years earlier. Titan had held the man's body for 11 hours before extraction teams could safely approach. In the 2 years since, he had bitten 4 people. Not strangers, handlers who were trying to bond with him. He did not want a bond. He wanted one specific person back, and that person was gone. Empress was a Dutch shepherd, female, 6 years old, wiry and ferociously fast, with a reputation among her former unit for being nearly impossible to read. She had never bitten anyone. What she had done was more unsettling. She simply refused to respond to any command from any handler who was not her original trainer, completely shut down, eyes forward, ears flat, motionless. 3 different experts had evaluated her. All 3 had reached the same conclusion. She was not broken. She was waiting. What she was waiting for, nobody could determine. Ranger was a Labrador retriever, male 8 years old, a former explosive detection asset whose handler had retired from service due to a traumatic brain injury. Ranger had been transferred 4 times in 18 months. He destroyed every kennel he was placed in. Not because he was vicious, because the silence at night was unbearable to him, and the only thing that had ever made it stop was the sound of one particular man's voice. Vega was a Belgian Malinois, female, 5 years old, 1 deployment, a psychological profile that described her as extraordinarily sensitive and extraordinarily volatile. Her handler had died by suicide 6 months after returning from overseas. Vega had been with him when he was found. The trauma had calcified inside her into something the behavioral evaluators struggled to name. She did not attack. She did not flee. She sat in the far corner of her run and watched the door with an expression that a shelter volunteer had described in her incident report as grief. The volunteer had been gently told that dogs did not experience grief in the way the word implied. The volunteer had quit the following week. Atlas was a Rottweiler, male, 10 years old, the oldest of the 7, a former personal protection asset for a classified diplomatic security detail. His file was partially redacted. What was visible indicated that he had served for 6 years under one handler without incident. What had happened to that handler was listed as classified. Atlas arrived at Maricopa with no behavioral incidents in his record, no bite history, and an absolute refusal to eat, unless the food was placed inside his kennel from a distance, and all human beings left the immediate area. He had lost 14 pounds since arriving. The veterinary staff were monitoring him with increasing urgency. The 7th dog was named 7. Nobody knew why. It was the name printed on his intake paperwork, and nobody had thought to change it. He was a German Shepherd mix, 3 years old, the youngest in the block, and arguably the most dangerous. He had been used in an overseas detection and apprehension role, and had been transferred to civilian federal law enforcement before something went badly wrong during an apprehension operation. His handler had walked away from federal service entirely. 7 had been surrendered with a note attached to his kennel card in the handler's handwriting. It said only, "He needs someone who understands what he saw. I can't be that person anymore. I'm sorry." Robert Mack had read that note 40 times. He could not make himself throw it away. The disposition timeline for all 7 dogs was 3 weeks out. The paperwork was prepared. Mack had delayed signing it twice already, which was 2 times more than he had ever delayed anything in 19 years of military service. He told his staff it was a resource allocation issue. The staff said nothing, because they knew their director well enough to know when he was lying to himself. It was a Tuesday morning in early October when the email arrived. Mack almost deleted it without reading it. His spam filter caught roughly 60 unsolicited messages a week from animal welfare organizations, retired veterans asking about specific dogs, journalists requesting comment on the military working dog program, and a rotating cast of well-meaning civilians who seemed to believe that the right amount of love and patience could rehabilitate any animal, regardless of what that animal had actually endured. Mack had no hostility toward those people. He simply had no time for them. The practical realities of running a high-restriction facility with a staff of 11 and a federal budget that had been cut 3 years running did not leave room for philosophical discussions about love and patience. But the email header stopped him. It did not come from a rescue organization. It came from a mill address. The sender's name was Colonel Patricia Reyes, United States Army, retired. The subject line contained 4 words. Please read this entirely. Mack poured his second coffee of the morning, sat back in his chair and read. Colonel Reyes wrote with the directness of someone who had spent 30 years saying exactly what she meant to people who needed to hear it. She did not waste sentences. She explained that she was writing on behalf of a young woman named Marisol Vega, 24 years old, from San Antonio, Texas, who had specifically requested this contact through official channels. She noted that Marisol was not a veteran, not a trainer, not a federal employee, and not affiliated with any animal welfare organization. She was a graduate student in behavioral psychology at the University of Texas. She worked part-time at a county animal shelter on weekends. She had no official credentials that would qualify her for any kind of access to a restricted federal facility. What she did have, the colonel wrote, was a connection to 6 of the 7 dogs currently housed in the Maricopa High Restriction Block that no behavioral evaluator, no trainer, and no federal official had been able to explain. And Colonel Reyes, who had spent 3 decades evaluating people and situations across 4 continents, stated flatly that she had never written a letter like this one in her entire career, and she needed Mac to take it seriously. Mac set his coffee down. He read the letter 3 more times. Then he picked up the phone. Marisol Vega had her father's last name, but almost none of his memories. Sergeant First Class Daniel Vega had deployed for the first time when Marisol was 18 months old. He had come home briefly, when she was 3, long enough for a handful of photographs she could not actually remember being taken. And then he had gone again. After that, the timeline of her early childhood was mostly constructed from her mother's careful stories and a small cardboard box of letters and photographs that sat on the shelf in the hallway of their apartment in San Antonio like a quiet altar. Daniel Vega had been a military working dog handler for 11 years. He had partnered with 4 dogs across 3 deployments. He talked about each of them in his letters, the way other men talked about their closest friends, with specificity, with warmth, with the particular tenderness of someone describing a person who had saved their life more than once and never once asked for anything in return. He had died when Marisol was 7 years old, during a nighttime operation in a province whose name she had not been permitted to know until she was old enough to find it herself. The details of what happened were still partially classified. What she knew was that his dog had been with him at the end. What she knew was that the dog had been wounded. What she knew was that both of them had been brought home, but only one of them in the way you come home when you're still breathing. She had grown up with that knowledge, sitting in the center of her life like a stone. She had not built her education around it consciously. She had simply always been drawn toward understanding what happens inside a mind when it loses what it cannot bear to lose. She had studied animal behavior with the same intensity she brought to human psychology, because somewhere along the way she had come to believe that the two were less different than most people assumed. She had started researching military working dog welfare in her 2nd year of graduate school. She had read everything publicly available, and a considerable amount that was available only through the kind of persistent, methodical information requests that most people give up on after the 3rd denial. She had compiled a database of documented cases where retired military dogs exhibited extreme behavioral dysregulation following the death or permanent separation from a bonded handler. She had written a thesis chapter arguing that the standard behavioral framework applied to these animals was fundamentally insufficient because it treated their trauma responses as pathology rather than as intelligible communication. Her thesis advisor had found it compelling but academically unprovable. Marisol had found Colonel Reyes through a veterans advocacy network, and Colonel Reyes had agreed to make exactly 1 phone call and write exactly one letter on her behalf. Not because she was certain Marisol's theory was correct, because she had spent 30 years making decisions about human beings in impossible situations, and she had learned to recognize the specific quality of conviction that separated people who were right from people who merely believed they were. Marisol Vega had that quality, and so Colonel Reyes had written the letter and Robert Mack had read it, and 3 days after reading it, he drove to the airport in Phoenix to pick up a graduate student from San Antonio who had arrived with a single carry-on bag, a manila folder full of research, and an expression of absolute, unwavering calm that unsettled him. Before she had said a single word, she was not what he had expected. He was not sure what he had expected, but it was not this. She was not particularly tall, not physically imposing in any way. She wore plain dark jeans and a grey long-sleeved shirt. She had dark hair pulled back and her father's steady brown eyes. She shook his hand with a firm, dry grip and said she was grateful. He had agreed to meet her and that she would not waste his time. He believed her. In the car, she asked questions about the facility that were not the questions civilians usually asked. She did not ask whether the dogs were happy. She asked about their feeding schedules and whether those schedules had changed since arrival. She asked about staff rotation patterns and whether the same personnel entered the high restriction block consistently or whether that varied. She asked whether any of the 7 dogs had shown behavioral differences based on time of day, weather, or ambient noise levels. She asked whether the facility used scent-based enrichment protocols, and if so, what materials were used. Mack answered everything. He was not entirely certain why. He was a man who did not discuss facility protocols with unauthorized personnel as a matter of absolute principle. But her questions were not the questions of someone who wanted to feel something. They were the questions of someone who was building a picture. By the time they arrived at the facility, he was listening to her more carefully than he had listened to anyone in years. She asked to walk the perimeter of the high-restriction block before entering. Mack said that was unusual. Marisol said she understood that and asked again. They walked the perimeter. She moved slowly. She did not speak. Her hands were at her sides and her breathing was deliberate, like someone managing their own nervous system with practiced precision. At the far corner of the block, near the ventilation panel that ran along the base of the eastern wall, she stopped. From inside the building came the low, continuous ambient sound of 7 dogs in various states of distress, pacing, whining, the occasional flat, joyless bark that sounded less like communication and more like a reflex, a sound a body makes when the silence becomes unbearable. Marisol stood at the corner for 2 full minutes without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, to nobody in particular, "They're not aggressive. They're exhausted." Mack said nothing because he did not know what to say. He had been running the facility for 4 years, and he had never heard anyone describe those 7 animals in a way that made him feel as though he had been misreading them the entire time. But she said it with such quiet certainty that it lodged somewhere in his chest and would not move. They went inside. The high restriction block was a long concrete corridor with reinforced kennel runs on both sides. The lighting was institutional and flat. The smell was industrial cleaner and dog and something underneath, both of those things that had no clinical name, but that anyone who had ever worked in a place like this recognized immediately. It was the smell of animals who had been waiting for a very long time for something that was not coming. The 7 dogs reacted to their entry the way they always reacted to human entry. Ghost lunged at the kennel door, all velocity and fury, the chain link rattling under the force of his impact. Titan stood at the back of his run, with his shoulders locked and his eyes flat and dangerous. Empress did not move at all. Ranger circled his kennel in tight, anxious loops. Vega retreated to her corner. Atlas watched the door with those hollow, exhausted eyes. Seven pressed himself against the far wall of his run and made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a cry. The two facility staff members who had accompanied them took a reflexive step backward. Marisol did not. She stopped in the center of the corridor and stood completely still. Her hands were at her sides, palms slightly open. She looked down the corridor slowly, taking in each dog in turn. Not quickly, not with any kind of urgency, but with the patient steadiness of someone who was simply present. Really present, in the specific way that animals recognize, and that most human beings have forgotten how to be. The dogs kept reacting. Ghost hit the kennel door again. Seven's sound escalated briefly. But Marisol did not flinch, did not adjust her posture, did not send any of the involuntary signals of fear or tension that these particular animals had spent years learning to read and respond to. Mac watched her and felt something shift in the room that he could not quantify in any report he might later be required to write. She stood there for 4 minutes. He timed it. At the 4-minute mark, Ranger stopped circling. He stopped and he looked at her. It was not an aggressive look. It was not the strategic assessment of an animal calculating a threat. It was something else. Something that made the younger of the two staff members take a quiet breath. Marisol spoke then, not loudly, not softly, but in the measured, grounded tone of someone delivering information they were absolutely certain of. She said, "I know what you're waiting for, and I know it isn't coming. But I'm here now, and I need you to hear me." Ghost stopped lunging. The corridor did not go silent exactly, but it changed. The frequency of the sounds changed. The random urgent energy shifted into something that was harder to name and impossible to dismiss. Mac took a slow breath. He had been in that corridor hundreds of times. He had never heard it sound like this. Marisol walked forward. Not to any specific kennel, just forward, down the center of the corridor slowly, and she began to talk. Not commands, not training language. She talked the way someone talks, when they are telling the truth to someone who desperately needs to hear it. She said she understood what it was to grow up with a photograph instead of a person. She said she understood what it was to carry a loss so total that the whole world afterward felt like it was in the wrong language. She said she was not there to replace anyone. She was not there to pretend that what was lost was not lost. She said, "I just want to help you put it down. That's all. You've been carrying it long enough." Atlas moved. He had not moved voluntarily toward a human being in 6 months. He crossed his kennel in 4 slow steps and pressed his nose to the chain-link door. What happened next? All 5 people present would later attempt to describe in separate accounts. Each account would emphasize different details. But all 5 agreed on the essential sequence of what followed. Marisol stopped in front of Atlas's kennel. She looked at the old Rottweiler for a long moment, and then she said a name, not loudly, almost under her breath, the way you say the name of someone you love when you are standing at their grave. The name was not in any file. Mac did not recognize it. The staff members did not recognize it. Later, through Colonel Reyes and a chain of follow-up inquiries that took 3 weeks and crossed 4 different federal agencies, they would discover that it was the name Atlas's original handler had called him in private. Not his kennel name, his real name. The name the handler had used alone with the dog on quiet nights. The name that meant, "You are safe, and I am here, and this is enough." Nobody outside that handler's immediate circle had ever known it. When Marisol said it, Atlas pressed the full weight of his broad head into the chain-link door and made a sound that nobody in that corridor would ever fully be able to describe to someone who had not heard it. It was not a bark. It was not a whine. It was the sound of a 10-year-old animal who had been holding a grief so heavy it had started to collapse him from the inside, and who had just, against every expectation, been understood. Within 30 seconds of that sound, every dog in the high restriction block went silent, not subdued, not suppressed, silent. The kind of silence that only happens when something necessary has finally been said. Mac stood in the center of that corridor with a decorated military career and 19 years of hardened practical experience and tears on his face that he did not bother to wipe away because there was nobody in that room who would have judged him for them. The days that followed were not simple or cinematic. Real healing never is. Marisol stayed at the facility for 11 days. She slept in the sparse staff quarters and woke before sunrise every morning to be at the block before the first feeding. She worked methodically, individually, without drama. Each dog required something different. What they shared was the need to be met where they actually were, not where the behavioral charts said they should be. Ghost needed her to prove, over and over, through small, consistent actions across multiple days, that she was not going to disappear. Every time she left his kennel area, he had to watch her go and see her come back. On the 4th day, he stopped lunging when she entered. On the 7th day, he ate from her hand. Titan required something harder. He required her to sit with him in his grief without trying to fix it. She sat outside his run for 2 hours on the 2nd day and said nothing at all, just sat. He watched her with those flat, dangerous eyes, and she looked steadily back without pressure or demand. On the 3rd day, he sat down. On the 5th day, he laid his heavy head on her knee through the chain link and stayed there until she had to leave. Empress, responded the moment Marisol stopped trying to get a response. The Dutch shepherd had spent months ignoring every approach precisely because every approach carried the weight of expectation. When Marisol simply existed near her without wanting anything, Empress stood up, walked to the front of her kennel, and waited, as if she had been waiting all along for someone who was not trying. Ranger needed movement. He needed to not be still. On the 3rd morning, Marisol asked Mac if she could take him into the exercise yard and simply walk laps beside him without a destination. Mac said that was a significant safety risk given Ranger's aggression history. Marisol said she understood that and asked again. They walked laps for an hour. Ranger destroyed nothing. At the end of the hour, he sat beside her in the winter sun and put his head back and closed his eyes, and it was the first time in 14 months that the animal who had torn apart 3 separate kennels from raw, inconsolable grief simply rested. Vega was the one that cost Marisol the most. She knew the dog's name was the same as her own family name. She had known it before she came, had seen it in the intake file, and felt the weight of that coincidence settle over her like something that was not quite coincidence. She sat outside Vega's kennel on the first evening, after the corridor moment when the other dogs had quieted, when the facility staff had gone home, when it was just the 2 of them in the low amber light of the high restriction block. Vega was in her corner. Marisol said nothing for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, I know what happened to your person. I know what it was, and I need you to know it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have stopped it. You couldn't have fixed it. Some things are too broken for any of us to hold together, no matter how much we love them. That's not something you carry. That belongs to the rest of us, the ones who should have done more. Not you. Vega did not move for a long time. Then she stood up, crossed her kennel slowly, and pressed her forehead against the chain link, Marisol pressed her palm flat against the metal and held it there. They stayed like that for 20 minutes, while the desert wind moved against the outside walls and the facility settled into the quiet that only comes very late at night, when everything that needs to be said has been said and the silence that follows is not empty. 7 was last. He was always going to be last. He was the youngest and the most fractured, and also, in the way that the most fractured things sometimes are, the one with the most capacity left. 3 years old, his whole life still technically ahead of him. But behind those young eyes was the accumulated weight of things no 3-year-old creature, human or animal, should have seen, and the note from his former handler had been sitting in Marisol's jacket pocket since she arrived. She read it again on the 10th night. He needs someone who understands what he saw. I can't be that person anymore. I'm sorry. She folded it carefully and put it back. On the 11th morning she went to his kennel before feeding time, before the facility was fully awake, before any of the ambient noise of an operational day had begun. The desert was still cool. A strip of pale gold was beginning at the horizon over the eastern fence line. 7 was already awake. He always was. He slept in short windows and spent most of the night watching the door, the way young soldiers watch the perimeter when the adrenaline of their first deployment has not yet been processed and the body has not yet learned the difference between danger and silence. Marisol sat down on the concrete floor in front of his kennel, cross-legged, as low and as small as she could make herself. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know exactly what you saw. I know it was bad. I know it changed you. I know the person who was supposed to help you through it couldn't do it, and that wasn't a failure on your part. That was just the way things broke. And I know that right now the world feels like it's made entirely of threats because that's what it was made of for a while. And your body learned that lesson so well, it can't unlearn it on its own." She paused. She said, "But here's what I also know. You're still here. You made it through everything that tried to end you. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." 7 moved forward from the wall. 1 step. Then another. He stopped 18 inches from the kennel door and looked at her with an expression that was nothing like aggression and nothing like submission. It was the expression of an animal making a decision, the specific, deliberate look of a mind that has been locked for a very long time, slowly, carefully, beginning to open. He sat down. He had not voluntarily sat in the presence of a human being since his surrender. Marisol exhaled. She stayed seated on the floor. She reached her hand slowly toward the kennel door, palm up, fingers loose, offering without demanding. 7 looked at her hand for a long time. Then he stretched his neck forward and sniffed her fingers. Just once, pulled back, looked at her face, sniffed again, and then he laid down on his side of the chain link, his nose just touching the mesh, and closed his eyes. Marisol sat with him until the sun cleared the fence line, and the gold became white, and the desert started its daily transformation from quiet to scorched. She did not cry. She had used up most of her tears over the 11 days, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular overwhelming feeling that comes when something that seemed impossible turns out to just have been waiting for the right conditions. She had a word for it from her graduate research, the moment when a dysregulated system finds its own equilibrium, but the clinical language felt insufficient and small for what she had witnessed in this facility. What she had witnessed was 7 different kinds of grief, finding 7 different kinds of permission to rest. On the final morning, before her flight, Marisol stood in Mac's office while he finished the paperwork she had helped him prepare. The disposition column for all 7 dogs had been updated. It no longer said pending. Mac signed the last page and set his pen down. He said, without looking up, "I need to ask you something. The name you said to Atlas. I still don't fully understand how you knew it." Marisol was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "His handler's name was in a veterans memorial database I'd been building for my research. I found a photograph of him with Atlas from before his last deployment. In the photograph, his hand was resting on the dog's head, and he was looking at the camera, but the dog was looking up at him. The expression on that dog's face told me everything. I just had to figure out what the man had given him to look like that." She paused. She said, "It took me 6 months to find the name. I found it in a letter his sister gave me. He had mentioned it once, very briefly in passing, the name he used when it was just the two of them. When the mission was over and the gear was off, and it was just a man and his dog, in a quiet room somewhere trying to remember what peace felt like, Mac was quiet for a long time. He said, 6 months for one dog," Marisol said. 6 months for one name. The dog took about 4 minutes. For the first time since she had arrived, Robert Mac smiled. It was a small, battered, genuine thing, the smile of a man who had spent 4 years in a facility built for endings and had just watched something that felt unmistakably like a beginning. He said, "What happens to them now?" Marisol opened her folder. Each of the 7 dogs had been matched, through the network she had built over 3 years of research, to a placement specifically selected for them. Not generic good homes. Specific people, specific environments, assessed against specific needs. A retired combat medic with a quiet farm in eastern Tennessee for Titan. A woman in New Mexico who had lost her son overseas and whose application had made Mac clear his throat twice while reading it. For Vega, a search and rescue trainer in Oregon for Ghost, whose drive and intensity, properly channeled, would save lives for years. Atlas was going to a hospice volunteer program, which had surprised Mac until Marisol explained that dogs who have sat with death and learned to stay present through it sometimes become the most extraordinary comfort to humans who are facing it. 7 was staying. He was going to Marisol. Mac looked at her. She said, "He needs someone who understands what he saw." That's what the note said. "I think that's me." She had not planned to say that. Or perhaps she had been planning it since she first read his intake file, since she first saw that handwritten note, since the morning he laid down on his side of the chain link and closed his eyes and allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to simply rest. Mac nodded slowly. He said, "Your father would have understood exactly what you did in there." Marisol picked up her bag. She looked out the window at the desert, at the pale winter light falling across the facility grounds, at the chain link and the steel buildings and the exercise yard where a Labrador had walked laps in the sun and finally sat still. She said, "He taught me everything that mattered before I was old enough to know I was learning it. I just didn't realize until now that I'd been carrying it all this time." She turned toward the door. She said, "He'd be glad I finally put it to use." 3 months later, in a community hall in San Antonio, 7 military working dogs and their new families gathered for what was billed officially as an adoption finalization event, but which felt, to everyone present, like something else entirely. It felt like a ceremony. Like the kind of acknowledgement that usually comes too late, but had on this particular occasion managed to arrive exactly when it was needed. Mac attended. Colonel Reyes attended. A number of people from various corners of the military and federal law enforcement community attended. People who had been quietly following the developments at the facility through the networks that carry certain kinds of information that never quite makes it into official reports. Ghost walked in on a loose leash, head up, coat gleaming, looking nothing like the animal that had thrown himself against kennel doors and drawn blood from 4 people. Titan's new handler, the medic from Tennessee, had his hand resting lightly on the shepherd's shoulder and was talking quietly to him while Titan watched the room with calm, alert eyes. Empress moved through the crowd with a fluid, self-possessed grace that made her original assessment, the one that said she was too unpredictable, too withdrawn, essentially unreachable, feel like a description of an entirely different animal. Ranger sat beside a young boy, a nephew of his new handler, and allowed the child to lean against his flank and talk at him with the relentless, detailed enthusiasm of small children who have found something they love. Vega stayed close to her new person, a quiet woman named Elena, whose grief was still visible in the particular careful way she moved through the world, as though everything in it was slightly fragile, and she had been trusted to keep it from breaking. Vega pressed against her side, and Elena's hand rested on the dog's back with the unconscious ease of something that had always been true, and had simply been waiting to be discovered. Atlas was the one who made the room quiet. He came in last, moving with the slow dignity of an old soldier, his broad head up, his dark eyes surveying the room with a steadiness that had nothing to do with threat assessment and everything to do with a settled, deep awareness. He found a spot near the center of the room and lay down, and within minutes, 3 different people who did not know each other had gravitated into the orbit of his calm and sat near him. Speaking softly, leaning in close, drawn by something they could not have explained but did not question. Marisol stood near the window with 7 at her side. He was watching the room with his young, serious eyes, processing it all, occasionally glancing up at her for confirmation that it was safe, that all these people and sounds and movements were not a threat. Each time he looked up, she looked back down at him, and whatever he found in her face was sufficient. He would look away again, satisfied, and continue his steady, careful inventory of the world. She thought about her father. She thought about the letters in the cardboard box on the shelf in her mother's hallway. She thought about the photograph of a man she had not been old enough to know. His hand on the head of a dog, and the dog's eyes looking up at him with that specific expression that told her everything she had needed to find her way to this room. She thought, I'm glad I learned how to read it. Mac found her near the end of the evening. He handed her a coffee, the good kind, not the facility version, and stood beside her watching the room. He said, You know there are 43 more dogs in facilities like mine across the country. Marisol looked at him. She said, I know. He said, and you have 3 more years of funding left on your research grant. She said, I know that too. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Good. 7 leaned against Marisol's leg, and she reached down and rested her hand between his ears, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breathing, feeling the warmth of an animal who had finally, after a long and brutal journey, arrived somewhere that felt like it was meant for him. Outside, the San Antonio evening was settling into the particular amber warmth of a Texas autumn, the kind of light that makes even ordinary things look as though they have weight and meaning. It fell through the windows of the community hall and moved across the room slowly, touching the scarred muzzles and the graying ears and the quietly brilliant eyes of 7 dogs who had been declared unreachable, were not, who had simply been waiting for someone to say the right name. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who understands what loyalty really costs and what it means when it finally comes home. Subscribe for more stories about the bonds that hold when everything else breaks.